I am very worried that this set of circumstances will assuredly, we will have a recession. And then the deficits go up. And then it's very difficult at that time because people are at each other's throats. I think that if there's one thing I can give people, and I'm compelled to give people now, it's an understanding of the mechanics and the supply demand so that people will understand how to answer that question, which is why, as a global investor for 50 years who's been through many of these, I wanted to pass along, my book, my description of the mechanics. So in answering your question, I want to say why it's a compelling moment, and that if they do not bring it down to 3% of GDP from where it'll be about 7% of GDP, they have to bring it down by 4% of GDP, that there is very high likelihood of real problems. It has to be done by three things. There is, and it has to be spread out among these three things, because any one of those three things would be too painful. And those three things are tax revenue, spending cuts, and interest rates. Although Congress and the president and the process does not deal directly with the third of those, right now $1 trillion, half of our deficit, is interest payments. And not only do we have $1 trillion interest payments, in the next year, we have $9 trillion of debt maturing that has to be either rolled over or sold. So there is what I call my 3% three-part solution, which was very similar to 1991 to 98. It was cut by 5% of GDP. The budget deficit in those years was cut by 5% of GDP by spreading it around. So the three things are needed. So if there's a mantra that about 4%, here's the magnitudes of it. About 4%, if it came from tax revenue, doesn't mean tax rates, but it could be tax revenue. 4% was cut from the budget deficit. That would naturally change the supply-demand picture to bring down interest rates by 1 to 1.5%, which would itself reduce the deficit by another 2% or so. Where it comes is a political question. In other words, yes, you can let the tax expire, or so many different ways. You can do so many different ways. I would allow important tax increases in a way that also, my own view would be improve education, improve productivity in a way that raises productivity for most people, and so on. But this is not my political. Okay, I want to say whether you turn left or you turn right. What I'm seeing when I go down there, and I speak to both sides of Congress, who are the people who are responsible for this, nobody disagrees with the need to go to 3% of GDP in that number. And what I'm seeing in politics is that there is, it's like being on a ship that's headed to rocks. And there are those who want to turn right and those who want to turn left. And they're so hell-bent on arguing of whether they turn right or left that they will not get past, they're going to hit the rocks. If interest rates are unnaturally cut by the central bank printing money or pushing down interest rates unnaturally, the bond market will not want to own that. Think about when you're owning a bond, what you're getting is interest rates. So the dollar will go down, the value of money will go down, and it's discouraging. we're now in a world geopolitical situation that relates to many things such as self-sufficiency and so on. It can bring in a lot of money. It also creates a less efficient world economy. Well, so how the deficits or how the tariffs are put into place, what amounts, how, has to be done scientifically to get away with that tax revenue. So tax revenue can come from that, but that is a matter of surgery, and it has to be done carefully, and it has to be done moderately so as to not disrupt that. I'm concerned about that. But that is not going to be enough. We have a giant imbalance. The world, the United States, is the largest consumer in the world. And it's largely because the US government gets in debt and distributes the money, and it's a consumer. As we have correctly, we've lost our ability to manufacture. China is the largest manufacturer in the world and is in the other side of that. They lend us the money to borrow to buy their goods. And now we have a big imbalance. We have a capital imbalance and we have a trade imbalance between that in a world that there's a risk of going to war. And so as we deal with self-sufficiency, increasingly, we have to become more self-sufficient. It's a reality in this. And we have to become more balanced in that one way or another. So if that's done economically, we have a population that is not productive and manufacturing. We now have a great polarity of wealth. 60% of Americans have below a sixth grade reading level. And there's a productivity problem and there's an economic problem. So if that is dealt with in a scientific and a balanced way, that could have some benefits. It's not a black and white situation, but it has to be done with that kind of thoroughness and so on. One way or another, the imbalances will go away. The debt imbalances, the trade imbalances, the capital imbalances, because they cannot be sustained in the world that now exists. So that it's coming to an end. I'm worried about all of, let's go back to the debt. I'm worried about that the demand for those bonds will not be equal to the supply. And I'm worried that as the debt now is at this point where it starts to, you have to acquire debt to service debt. You have to borrow money to service it, $10 trillion a year in debt service. That when you have that kind of condition, that you will have an unsustainable situation, so that the central bank, the Federal Reserve, will be put into a position of either being seeing interest rates rise a lot because of that problem, crowding out other spending, and costing it money because they own a lot of bonds, and letting that happen, or then having to print money and buy those bonds, which depreciates the value. Very similar to the 1970s. We're certainly going to have, we always have recessions. Now, just imagine what happens if you have a recession. On average, since 1945, when the New World Order began, we've had 12 and a half cycles, of which there have always been recessions. You're always going to have a recession. I am very worried that this set of circumstances will assuredly, we will have a recession. And then the deficits go up. And then it's very difficult at that time because people are at each other's throats. So there's going to be an internal fight. The important thing is to deal with this now, okay? Before you have a lot more debt, before you have a lot more compounding of the debt, before you have a recession. What I mean by that is the 1930s was a period that had a debt crisis. The governments were dysfunctional, and four democracies chose to go to more autocratic policies for somebody to get control of the situation in order to fix the situation. So that you had a debt problem. What Germany did, and a number of countries, is that they essentially defaulted on the debt. They didn't pay the debt. And then you have that more autocratic type of policy because the people want somebody to get control of this situation. And then you have the classic conflict between the left and the right. Okay, this has happened repeatedly, the left and the right. And then you have a fight between the left and the right. This has happened repeatedly. I'm referring to the 30s, but this has happened repeatedly throughout history. So where that happens, because if we lose our economic well-being, if we lose our health economically and our power economically, if we lose the dollar as a world reserve currency, it reverberates through not only American power around the world, it reverberates through the world because the dollar, the U.S. bond market, the treasury market is the backbone of all markets. And so that could produce that kind of trauma. So how they get there in the particular trade-offs are for those experts and those representatives in Washington to weigh those considerations. It's not for me to weigh those considerations.